Welcome to the Gateway Talks. Master Sessan's 3 tips for Zen training. Master Sessan said, "In our daily life we should remember 3 things. Joining the palms is in prayer, bowing is in worship, and charity. Joining the palms is the best posture for bringing the body and mind into a state of unity. The bow means honor and respect for others. Charity is the basis of peace in society. If we practice them, it is certain that we shall in turn receive." So this is an extract of a sermon from Master Sessan, who may not be so well known as a Zen master. He actually lived in the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. For those people who are familiar with Trevor Leggett's book, The First Zen Reader, there's a section in there on the Song of Meditation by Master Hakuin, and that has a commentary by Master Sessan, which is actually taken from a series of lectures that he gave on the radio in Japan in the 1930s, which was translated and collated by Trevor Leggett for that book. So he was certainly a well-known figure in Japan, and of course Master Hakuin was also a very well-known figure in Japan, much loved, and that's why obviously Sessan gave those particular talks on that poem, which is particularly famous, the Song of Meditation. Here, it doesn't actually say who he's speaking to, whether it's his monks or, I think probably more likely he's speaking to lay people as well as monks. It just has that sense of it. And what I think is particularly good about this, and perhaps what's useful for us as Zen practitioners, is that it has quite a wide appeal. I think the way that he puts over what the Zen practice is in a slightly different way. But what I hope to show with this talk is how, in fact, this is exactly what our practice is about. And just to begin with, it starts by him saying, "In our daily life." And of course, this is a really good reminder that our practice is about our daily life. One of the problems, I think, that can come with both the terms meditation and mindfulness practice is that it becomes something that is done, on occasion, almost distinct from what's going on in our daily lives. I've even heard this. I know when I heard some of the early people on TV, when mindfulness became, very popular, people were talking about using mindfulness as a way of coping for stress and having it in your sort of anti-stress toolbox and that sort of thing, and using the breath and all this sort of thing. But it was very occasional. The notion was that this was something that you do, rather in the same way that you take an aspirin when you have a headache. You don't take an aspirin all the time. Obviously, that is the way that you take aspirin. Mindfulness was and meditation were being used in something of the same way. And that's not how they were originally derived. And it's certainly not how they're used in Zen practice either. My own late teacher, Dayu Myokyo, she didn't use the term mindfulness. She used this term, daily life practice. It's a practice that we do in our daily lives. And this is something else as well. Sometimes we can get a little bit carried away, and I've sort of said this before, with being Buddhist, in scare quotes, that we think we now have to do things, be a certain type of person that's sort of different to how we are anyway. And okay, I mean, there are things like precepts and so forth, but it doesn't necessarily mean, we have to radically change our lives. In fact, we don't need to radically change our lives. I've been teaching now for around about 30 years, and on a few occasions I have had people come up to me saying, "Oh, I'd really love to be a Buddhist, but I'm not in the right place right now." I had one guy come up around about sort of 2010, and he said, "Oh, I'd really love to practice Zen, but I'm in the wrong profession. I'm a banker." And this was at a time just after the crash of '08, when bankers weren't that popular. So I think he sort of felt that he couldn't possibly practice Buddhism and be a banker. I had someone else come up and say, yeah, well, I work in a shop and I can't practice right livelihood, one of the stages on the Noble Eightfold Path. I need to go and work for a charity or perhaps for, some kind of good cause, and then I'm practicing right livelihood. And these are very contrived notions of what, for example, right livelihood is actually about. Again, certainly if you go and have a look in the Pali Canon, there are certain livelihoods that are condemned by the Buddha, such as slavery, obviously, dealing with poisons, butchery, manufacturing weapons, and so forth. That's how they're written up in the Pali Canon. But actually, it has a much wider interpretation than that. And I know, again, my own late teacher, Dayu Myoko, she used to refer to right living. In fact, she has a book, Living Buddhism, how to live Buddhism, living Buddhism in that way. And in this way, if we have a look at, what right livelihood is about, obviously, how we earn a living. It's how we feed ourselves and clothe ourselves and house ourselves and so forth. And the fact that we go to work, we sell our labor, we receive money for it, we go to a shop, we, transfer that money to another person and we buy their labors as well. And all, if we're buying food, we're buying obviously a whole chain of people are involved in the production of that, and we are paying for their labor for that a fair price. So it's about, livelihood is actually about interdependence. It's about how we are dependent on the environment and the people around us and community and society in order to live. So it's about relating, it's about relationships, and it's about right relationships, and those relationships are governed obviously by things like precepts, decency, honesty, not stealing and not causing harm, and so forth. All those things ideally should be taken into account. But most importantly, it's about relationship and relating and recognizing that we are dependent for the way we live on other people and other things around us. So, right living takes into account, the food that we eat, where we live, how we treat our house, how we treat our environment, how we treat our neighbor as well, how we treat the people that we live and work with. So it's all about relating, and all these things bring us back to our daily life. Now, and this is why, the practice of mindfulness, as it's sometimes called, it's a 24/7 practice, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year practice. Now, we may not bring it off all the time. That's a different issue. But the point is that's really the attitude that we need to be developing as Buddhist practitioners, as Zen practitioners. And this is something that Master Sessan tries to bring out in these three suggestions that he asks us to remember. So in our daily life, we should remember three things: joining the palms as in prayer. So joining the palms as in prayer, sometimes people are surprised. People think that in Zen we don't pray, for example, or that there's no prayer in Zen. But actually there is. If you go to Japan, for example, people do go to the temple and pray for things, that's quite normal. The priests will also come to your house if it's the anniversary of the death of a family member, and will chant, put the hands together into what's called gasho. That's literally the how the Christians pray, with the hands in front of them. The palms are pressed together, the fingers and thumbs are extended and together. It's a form of supplication, or it's a sign of, it's iconographically, it's a sign of supplication, really the world over. Obviously we have it in Christianity and so forth, but it's also in Buddhism, in Hinduism, really the world over. And it's not just to deities either. I remember many years ago, when I was a child, one of my favourite books was the classic Larousse Encyclopedia of World Mythologies, and the very first section in there was about Sumeria and Sumerian religion. And there was a photograph of a statue of a Sumerian priest, and he was sitting in a chair, wearing a sort of tunic, with his head shaved, and he was there with his hands clasped together. It wasn't in the classic way. He sort of just gripped one hand with the other, but was holding the hands up in front of him, and clearly he was supplicating a deity of some sort. But the point is, this is a classic posture or position of supplication to someone or something other than oneself. And what this does is that it takes us out of ourselves when we do that, because to supplicate means also to revere, to look up to someone or something else. It's why it's very common, for example, when we go into Buddhist temples, when we meet each other, we put our hands together and we bow slightly towards the other person, perhaps instead of shaking hands, or as well as shaking hands. And that's very common. In India, it's also commonly done that people, will greet each other by putting their hands together and just smiling and inclining the head slightly. This is the bow. That is done, and it's a reverential thing. I do it to you, you do it to me, and there's a sort of, not necessarily conscious, but there's an acknowledgement there of a relationship and of an interdependence there. And at heart, interdependence is really at the heart of Buddhism. Those who are familiar with the teachings of the 12-link chain of arising due to conditions and the Buddhist wheel of life, it's all there. It's all there. The metaphysics is all there, but this is the practice. So the bow incorporates the understanding, the principle of dependent origination in that bow, and this is why it's so important. Joining the palms as in prayer, and he goes on to say also bowing, as in worship. So he actually links those two things together. And what he says a little bit later about it is that he says that joining the palms is the best posture for bringing the body and mind into a state of unity. And that's a really interesting thing to say, because we're all familiar, clearly, that, in the practice, in daily life practice, what's sometimes called mindfulness practice, we talk about being present, don't we? We talk about being at one with the here and now. And what that means is that instead of the body doing one thing, such as the washing up, and the mind being, 1,000 miles away in something else in the future or some alternative reality or something, that those two things are brought together, and that's what he's talking about. Instead of that continual internal chatter, we become present. The mind and the body become as one. And it's interesting because at the beginning, when we're learning this practice, one of the mistakes that we can get into is a sort of subtle escape from that oneness. We seek it on the one hand, but on the other hand, we're always slightly escaping from it. So this is where mindfulness can fall into, instead of really being at one with what is being done, say with the washing up, it can fall into a narration, that we suddenly discover there's a narrator narrating everything that I am doing. Right now I'm picking up the plate in my right hand, and with my left hand and the sponge I'm wiping it in a clockwise direction, and then I'm dipping it in, and then I'm lifting it out, and then I'm placing it into the rack on the draining board, and then I go for the cup, and then do this, and I can really get into this sort of, it's a very self-conscious way of being, but that's not actually what the mindful awareness really is. It's certainly not what giving myself into what at this moment is being done is really about. There's still that holding myself back and observing, narrating, watching myself is probably the best description, and that's not the same thing. The heart and the body, the heart, mind, body, whatever, all has to come together and become as one. And there are many times during the day when that happens quite naturally. For example, if it's something that we like, if it's a hobby, for example, playing football, or I don't know, I mean, even, doing a jigsaw, model building, even reading a book, we say, oh, I became really absorbed in it, and the time just flew, don't we? And that's the experience of being at one with. This is what happens. But actually, what Master Sessan is saying here is that in order to do that, and not having to wait, until it's something that I like, which is the picking and choosing, that's really the root of the problem, because there's a whole bunch of things that I don't like and I don't want to become at one with, yet need to be done, and so I grumble, and once again the body ends up doing one thing and I'm distracting myself with something else, and we've still got that split, which doesn't develop the inner strength. So what he says is circumvent all that by using the body, by using this posture. Posture's maybe not quite the right word, although that's what's used here. But using this ritual act, really, by bringing the hands together, it symbolizes, but it also brings us into accord with the very thing that it symbolizes. That is that being at one with. And that being at one with is a very distinct state, and this is what's known as samadhi, of course, in the Sanskrit. And Sokyan, who lived in the U.S. For many years in the early part of the 20th century, he talked about this. He used to complain a little bit, saying, that back in Japan, and this is in sort of 1920s and 30s, he said, nowadays, he says, all the young monks want to go off to university before they come to the temple and do their training. So they come back and they know lots about Buddhism and they're very intellectual, but they have no samadhi power. And he said it's that samadhi power is what's really important. He said in the old days, he said the young monks would come, they were children, and they would be taught samadhi power. That is really how to give themselves wholeheartedly into what at this moment is being done. They'd be given those very physical tasks, sweeping the leaves, washing the pots and the cups, etc., wiping things down, dusting, and all the very sort of, and they would learn to do these tasks whether or not they particularly felt like it. And what they discovered is that if they really just gave themselves physically into the activity, really wholeheartedly and with sincerity, then all of that gets wiped away. It transforms the experience of the doing into being, into becoming. And in the same way as the person who loves doing the jigsaw says, and the time flew, it's exactly the same. That's actually one signifier of being given in, is that actually, we are really engaged with it, and we forget everything else. We don't think, it's 2 minutes, it's only 3 minutes, which is, if I'm stuck doing a job that I really don't want to do, I'm looking at the clock all the time, because I don't want to be there, that's the desire, don't want to be there. Well, all that gets forgotten when we're at one with what this moment is being done. And the reason that that's forgotten is that the person, the self, who is grumbling, the self who doesn't want to be there, is forgotten as well. That all gets laid down. That's exactly why the Buddha taught the teaching of no I. Why he said, actually, this self that grumbles, that complains, that's always picking and choosing, I like this, but I don't like that. I will do this, but I won't do that. I'll tolerate this, but I won't tolerate that. The one that does all these things is very fluid. It comes and goes. It's not substantial or permanent, and we can show this to ourselves. And this is also why in the Zen training we talk about the body so much, and we use the body first. We don't, despite the fact that we're giving long talks here, we don't use lots of words. And this is what Sokyan was saying about those young kids. They know nothing about Buddhism. They'll learn that later. They will learn it, but they will just learn it later. What's really important is the samadhi power. If they've got the samadhi power, then they can go on to the contemplation. Then they can go on to the insight practice, the insight training. Because without that ability to be able to give oneself and to really stay and see it through, smoothing those edges away from that picking and choosing, then it can't be sustained. That ability for not concentration but that one-pointedness cannot be maintained. So it's a skill and it's a strength that comes with it as well, and that comes with that joining that palms as in prayer, and that's the point that sort of Sokyan was also making. And he went on actually in the same essay or in the same sermon. You can find it in his book, The Zen Eye. I think it's in the chapter called The Shape of Meditation. And he says, nowadays, he says, and he was in New York in the 30s. He says nowadays, he said, some people, you shake their hands and there's no strength in the arm because they're not really there. And he said it's the way people walk down the street. They sort of wander, they totter over from one side of the pavement to the other and back. He said they don't realise they're doing it because they're just not there. They're like, the light's on but no one's home. He said there's no strength in their body. Their strength has vanished into their thinking. They're thinking about something else. He said when we walk, we should we should use the strength that's in the abdomen. He said walk from your center. He said walk. Recently we were with some of the other people in the Zen Gateway team. We're producing some videos on basic practice such as Zazen and form in the Zendo and bowing, etc., which you'll be seeing on the website shortly. And one of the things that we put in was that when you go into the Zendo, the practice is that you walk in a straight line. There's none of this sort of hesitantly wandering about in a sort of meandering way. We walk with a determination, and you do that by walking in a straight line. And if you need to turn, you turn, and then you walk in a straight line. I mean, yes, it's slightly artificial in a Zendo, but when you get used to it, there's a real power in it. There's a real strength in that way of moving. I'm not saying that we don't walk round corners in a curved fashion or something like that when we're out on the pavement. But go back into that strength. When we walk, really walk from the center. Use the whole of oneself to walk, to move forward. And when we stop, use the whole of oneself to stop. When we reach, use the whole of oneself to reach. If we look at the Satipatthana Sutta, the Pali Canon, if we want to know where this comes from, the Satipatthana Sutra in the Pali Canon, the Buddha gives the instructions for daily life practice and for meditation. And he says, and it says it in there, he says, when a monk bends or stretches, he really knows he's bending and stretching. And what he means by that, he really knows, is that he is sincerely and wholeheartedly in that bending and stretching. So if we want to do this practice, then it's at that level, and it's at that level that the samadhi power appears, and it does appear. When we use that wholeheartedness, my goodness, suddenly there's a vitality there that wasn't there before, when we were just sort of, half-hearted, or thinking about it, or thinking about something else, or, well, maybe I'll do this tomorrow, whatever. So perhaps just something to ponder on, but more importantly, put into practice. Then afterwards he says bowing as in worship, and he says the bow means honor and respect for others. And again, this is that for others. This is something that's really important, because another thing that can arise, certainly in the early training, is that I hear about daily life practice or meditation practice, and it very quickly becomes my daily life practice, my meditation practice. And although this is why Myokyoni, Dayu Myokyo, like to use the term to give myself into rather than mindfulness practice, because it has that connotation of giving myself away into. It still can very quickly fall back to my practice, and then it becomes about my progress and so on. And it all becomes very centered on me and self-conscious and almost excluding what's going on around me. Everything else simply becomes part of the furniture of my practice. It's only important to me as far as my practice is concerned. I remember a good few years ago, someone I know who's a practitioner wrote to me said he'd had this experience. He'd been in his kitchen frying some onions, and he said, I really used the opportunity to give myself into the frying of the onions. He said, and at one point said I needed to turn round and take a spatula out of the drawer behind me, and I turned round, and he said my girlfriend was standing there in the way, and there was a moment of real annoyance that she was in the way. And he said, how could that happen? He said, if I'm really given away, then that I, who gets upset about these things, shouldn't be there. And he's quite correct in that. So he said, how come I was angry? I said, well, how come I was irritated? I said, well, obviously I very much was still there. But I think what was happening is that you had made the conscious intention to give yourself into this one task of the frying. And suddenly that becomes, instead of I giving myself into the situation, giving myself into the doing. Because when we give ourselves into the situation, of course, the nature of the situation is that it's undergoing impermanence, it's undergoing change. So when he turns round and his girlfriend's standing in front of the drawer that he wants to open, that is a moment of transformation, when the situation of frying the onions now transforms into waiting a moment till she moves out of the way and then opening the drawer. But of course, if I become fixated on the doing this one task, then daily life practice becomes a series of chunks, of separate chunks. First I will do this, then I will do that, then I will do the third thing, and so on. But actually, it's a one continuous movement. So once we give ourselves into what at this moment is being done, we continue giving ourselves into it. As the situation begins to change, so we also begin to flow and change with it. That's also part of the oneness. That's also part of the samadhi as well. And that allows for adaptation as the circumstances change. And that's the nature of it. I mean, don't forget the Buddha said that we do these things, in accordance with the nature of the circumstances. And one of the three signs of being, the first one is anicca. All things are subject to change. Sometimes they go, in a way I would like, and sometimes they go against that. And we adapt to that as best as we can, whilst maintaining that oneness. So the importance of the worship is that when we worship another. It's the other, whether that other is, the Buddha nature of the other person that we're with, or perhaps it's something more cosmic, like, the cosmic Buddha, the Sun Buddha, or something like that, or, the ancestors, or whatever it might be. It doesn't really matter. The principle remains the same, because it's all about acknowledging, respecting the relationship and the right relating in those circumstances. The third one, he then says, is charity. And charity, I don't know what the Japanese term that this word charity was translated from, but I suspect it might have something similar to dana, the Sanskrit term that means giving, and that can also be sometimes translated as charity into English. But either way, it doesn't really matter. The point of charity is that it's the functioning of that relationship. Once that relationship is there, then we are giving ourselves into that situation, with that other person. If the other person is asking that we listen to them, then we let go of what I was doing, reading the book, frying the onions, or whatever, and then say yes, and we turn and we give ourselves wholeheartedly into that. Very difficult thing to do. I mean, listening is a skill. As anyone who's a psychotherapist or a counsellor or has done mentoring or anything like that will know, it's the way to listen is by emptying out my own heart and mind to create a space so that what is being given to us in the words or the gestures or whatever can come in and can be understood. And if the more that one's own space in one's heart is filled up with my own preoccupations, then the less I can hear, and the less that we're able to take in. And this is where that skill of learning to read what's behind the words or what's between the lines can only really be cultivated to the proportion that we can empty our own heart. When we empty our own heart, then the heart itself becomes reflective. It becomes what's known as the heart mirror. And that's where consciousness simply reflects what comes into it in the round, in the absence of my own expectations and partiality. And in that, then, real genuine insight and knowledge can arise as a consequence of that. That's why this samadhi is so important. That samadhi power, as Sokian was talking about, was simply so important. So for this he says charity is the basis of peace